Brussels sprouts and cauliflower, onion, fennel and cucumber, plum, pear and papaya, aubergine and saya, lime, lentils and quinoa, oatmeal bread and oatmeal flour, watercress and okra, tofu and sweet pepper.
Veganism is now faced with a few problems recently, and I don't know if I'm able to not talk about them. So I'm just going to summarize a few issues that I've seen with a few individual activists and so on. It is really bad, I must say. Let me first talk about Paul Watson. No, not Paul Joseph Watson, Paul Franklin Watson, or Captain Paul Watson, the founder of Sea Shepherd Conservation Society. And the problem that I've seen here is that Sea Shepherd USA is no longer Sea Shepherd. And by that I mean they've totally changed up what Sea Shepherd stands for. They no longer do direct action, and they are not even vegan anymore, which is a huge issue. First, Paul Watson was taken down as board of director of Sea Shepherd USA, and after they've totally changed, then he left the organization. Following, only very recently, Paul Watson got a message from Alex Cornelissen, which is now like the top leader of Sea Shepherd internationally, said that he was actually voted out. He has been kicked out of the entire movement he created. So of all the animal rights movement / environmental movements, I never seen anyone being as successful as Sea Shepherd, where they've blocked vessels by standing in front of a ship. This was, I think it was Paul Watson and Robert Hunter that just stood in front of this sealing vessel, and it stopped. They've blocked harpoons, they've fought against the Japanese whaling industry, they've chased a toothfin vessel till they had to give up, so they sunk their own ship.
Yeah, everything was open, so if water comes into one area,
Goes into the next.
goes into the next and into the next. So everything that can float was open.
Right. Like, the list goes on. Sea Shepherd has done so much over the history of time, and by them now changing, it's not a good idea. And I hope that the rest of Sea Shepherd don't follow the example of Sea Shepherd USA, which today is just going to be like, sort of like a scientific observer type of organization. I think they should change name, honestly. And now with the conclusion of what really has happened with Anonymous for the Voiceless, where they figured out that the founders has actually taken an insane amount of money as their own pay for like the share of the organization. And I don't mind people taking a share if they own the organization, but it was so much money. Like, incredibly, too much, really. And another activist that I saw performed poorly in a debate, and I just wonder, is he vegan anymore at all? Because he made such a like well-first argument. And I'm talking about Alex O'Connor, or Cosmic Skeptic. In his debate with Michaela Peterson, he made such dumb comments all the time, and just to show you a few of them.
If we were still doing farming how we were a few hundred years ago, it would still be an interesting ethical problem to solve. There'd still be, especially if we have alternatives available, there'd be an important ethical question as to whether we have the right to breed animals into existence and take their lives away from them and inflict certain sufferings in their life. But it certainly wouldn't be the forefront of my campaigning. It wouldn't be the main thing that I spend my time doing.
Alex, what about rights? Is it okay to kill people who are not suffering?
Look, we have an animal suffering problem in factory farming, which on its own, in my view, I've said this a few times before, on its own is a good enough reason to abolish factory farming and probably go vegan.
Animals aren't only suffering in factory farming. They all go to the same slaughterhouse, for example.
There's an environmental case against factory farming because they're just absolutely disastrous to the environment, which, again, on its own, the environmental case would be good enough reason to abolish factory farming.
But you're forgetting that when they started with factory farming, then they started to control where the methane was going, and they also started to have control over where the poop was going. It is less of an environmental problem with factory farming than with traditional farming.
There's also a pandemic prevention case.
Zoonotic diseases don't only come from factory farming, it's basically the proximation with other species. And there's even a case for factory farming when it comes to preventing diseases, because then you're in a closed system. You can actually stop something from getting out if you discover it, which you can't in an open environment where they might infect other animals, get it from other animals, and so on.
I don't even like using the word vegan because people are sometimes upset with exactly how I use the word, how I define it, or the situations in which I think it would be permissible to eat animal products. A lot of people have told me that it's potentially misleading. Really, I just have a commitment to minimizing animal suffering. So, coming at this from an ethics perspective, more than a practical one, I quite simply just grant the conditional, right? If it is the case that this is going to minimize suffering, then that's the right thing to do. So if it turns out, let's say, that sort of hunting is actually a better way to procure our nutritional requirements, because of course we could eat plants, but plant production, plant agriculture requires killing animals too, and it's possible that in some circumstances hunting an animal might kill less animals and it might actually be less painful for that animal. Like, I don't know about the practicalities of that. I don't know, but I'm just willing to just grant easily that if it is actually the case that involves less animal suffering, then that is the thing to do.
So if less people died of cannibalism, would cannibalism be okay then? Like, you're forgetting something. We're not an animal welfarist movement. We are an animal rights movement.
Then even if you are killing an animal for food, if you're doing it in such a way that genuinely minimizes to the highest extent practicable all forms of animal suffering or exploitation, then it's not just that you're permissibly breaking veganism or something. Like, you're doing the vegan thing according to the ethical definition, which means that if there were a situation in which the way to minimize the amount of animal suffering was to go and, shoot the elk, then go and shoot the elk and call yourself a vegan for all I care. I'm just interested in the ethics of minimizing suffering here.
And if the most practical and practicable thing for me is to eat humans?
Yes, and of course, you're right that the science is still very much in its infancy, and we must be careful, okay? Like, this is really important. If there is a risk that this is actually really not nutritionally adequate and we're feeding it to children, not really knowing what we're doing, and essentially blinded by what becomes ideology.
No, plant-based diets has been studied for decades. It isn't really a question anymore. And to all of you who hate Name the Trait, well, Alex uses Name the Trait.
And so the name the trait argument can be surmised as saying something like, well, how like a pig and in what ways would that human have to be before you'd be okay with forcing it into a gas chamber?
Well, Alex, let me run Name the Trait on your position. So how similar to an elk does a human have to be to justify taking away their right to life, to kill them to reduce suffering, or to justify killing them because it's most practical? Well, Alex, you used to be number 2 on my list to be on my podcast Veg Talk before this. But now, I just want to debate you. You just kept granting things that's like, no, you shouldn't do that. And like, even that he brought up Name the Trait, but that was after he brought up like this utilitarian arguments and so on, and I was like, what the heck is going on? It just makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. And the last person that I got to bring up is Earthling Ed. Now, I don't see Earthling Ed as a problem, but there's just something that I need to say, and that is, he has turned into a terrible debater. Like, before he was like really good, like he could be kind, like it was really hard to be mad at him, but now it has gotten to such a degree that it's not even challenging the people he's talking to. It's just weird to me. And this is something that is bugging me. Maybe the pandemic has sort of like teared the activist movement apart, sort of, because there is very little activism going on. Well, at the moment, I've stepped away from activism for a while due to mental health, but I don't see much happening. And I'm not sure if there is any related or any realism to this, but I'm just like, we need to keep this movement together, because there are many people that think that this movement will die out, and at the moment you kind of like get that type of feeling, because there isn't much going on at the moment. It might be silly of me to think so, but it's like that type of feeling that I have. I just had to make this video, and it's because I felt there was just too many like loose threads all over the place. And I don't want to see the vegan movement turn into whatever it seems like it has turned into. And with those like high profile people being like either kicked off or just not debating properly or doing silly things like taking too much share, it's just, no, I don't like it. And I think it's awful. Like, if you have any like good news to bring forward, because I really need some positivity in this, I just can't deal with it.